Let's break it down straight from the hill to your hometown. No spin, no hype, just facts we find. AI's on the case, no truth left behind. Laws are written, deals are made. Who's got your back, who's throwing shade? We cut through the noise, decode the text, keeping it real. Congress in context, Congress in context, shining the light, breaking it down so you know what's right. Policies, folks, who's working for you? We bring the facts.
Welcome back, Deep Divers. Today, we are cracking open the Congressional Record.
The Congressional Record.
Yeah. It's that sometimes dusty, sometimes dramatic, but always revealing diary of Congress.
Sounds juicy.
Oh, it is. We've got a whole stack of entries here. And believe me, it's not all like dry legislative jargon.
Okay, good. I was a little worried about that.
Hidden among the bills and amendments, you'll find like tributes to hometown heroes, passionate pleas for change.
Oh.
Yeah. And even a few glimpses into the personal lives of our lawmakers.
Really? So it's like the human side of Congress.
Exactly. It's fascinating to see how that human element like weaves its way into this official record of, governance.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we'll be able to track not just what Congress is doing, but how they're thinking.
Right.
How they're framing the issues and how they're trying to persuade each other and ultimately the American people.
Exactly. So think of this deep dive as your shortcut to understanding what's really happening on Capitol Hill.
Love a good shortcut.
We'll be extracting the key takeaways, analyzing the arguments and connecting the dots to see how these congressional actions ripple outward.
Okay, so ripple effects. Got it.
Affecting policy and shaping the world we live in. We're going to roll up our sleeves and get into it.
I am. Let's start with a cluster of issues that are clearly dominating the conversation right now.
Okay, lay it on me.
Border security.
Big one.
International trade.
Yeah.
And that constant tug of war between economic interests and national security.
Our perfect place to start.
Yeah.
We've got H.R. 35, the Agent Raul Gonzalez Officer Safety Act, which is generating a lot of buzz.
I've heard of that one.
This bill's aim is to beef up protection for law enforcement at the border, proposing tougher penalties for those who attempt to evade them.
So basically making it riskier for people to try to cross illegally.
Right. Proponents are calling it a common sense approach to officer safety. And it's definitely tapping into the anxieties surrounding border security, anxieties that are reflected in a number of other bills and speeches we're seeing.
Makes sense. It's a hot button issue for sure, but it's not all about tightening the borders, is it?
You're right, it's not. We're also seeing pushback against certain trade policies, particularly from Congressman Courtney of Connecticut.
What's he saying?
He's been pretty vocal in his criticism of President Trump's tariffs, especially those targeting steel and aluminum imports from, of all places, Australia.
Australia.
Yeah, Australia. And what's interesting here is that he's not just raising economic concerns.
Right, because tariffs can impact prices and jobs.
Exactly.
That's true.
Those are certainly present. He's arguing that these tariffs actually violate existing trade agreements.
Oh, wow.
And could jeopardize our alliances in the Indo-Pacific region.
Which...
That's the vast area encompassing the Indian and Pacific Oceans, which is becoming increasingly important strategically.
Ah, I see. So he's worried about the bigger picture.
Yeah, he's making a good point about the potential for collateral damage on the international stage.
Yeah.
Especially since, from what I understand, we actually have a trade surplus with Australia.
Oh, really?
So it seems like we're potentially poking a friend in the eye
Yeah.
while trying to address a separate issue.
That's a good way to put it. And that's the kind of nuanced understanding we can gain from the Congressional Record.
Yeah.
It's not just about the headline-grabbing bills. It's about the underlying arguments, the competing priorities, and the potential unintended consequences that are often debated.
Absolutely. Speaking of competing priorities, let's shift our focus to the intersection of immigration and representation. We see the 7th annual Dominicans on the Hill event taking place,
Okay.
with visits from the Dominican Republic's Senate President and House President.
Sounds like a pretty big deal.
Yeah. And this is a great example of how the Congressional Record can reveal the growing influence of specific demographic groups.
Right, like a snapshot of who's making their voices heard.
Exactly. Clearly, Dominican Americans are making their voices heard in U.S. politics.
Absolutely. And this leads us to Congressman Espaillat, who represents parts of New York City with a large Dominican population.
Yeah, he's been a strong voice on immigration issues.
He's a powerful advocate for immigration reform, particularly when it comes to dreamers, farm workers, and families facing deportation.
He's been pushing for what he calls compassionate solutions while also acknowledging the need for border security.
So he's trying to find that middle ground.
It sounds like it.
Yeah.
Recognizing the human impact of immigration policies while still addressing concerns about border control.
It's a complex issue for sure.
Absolutely. And the Congressional Record allows us to see how lawmakers are grappling with those complexities in real time.
Precisely. And speaking of grappling with complexities, there's a fascinating anecdote from Congressman Smucker, a Republican from Pennsylvania.
Okay, what did he do?
Well, he shared how he uses the Scout Oath, yes, the one from the Boy Scouts, as a guiding framework for his legislative decisions.
Hold on, the Scout Oath. That's unexpected.
Oh.
Tell me more.
So he explained that before casting a vote, he asks himself a series of questions rooted in the Scout Oath's principles
Oh.
of duty to God, country, and others.
Interesting.
For example, he asks, is this righteous according to God's word? And will this benefit my constituents and the country as a whole?
Wow. So he's really using his faith and those Scout principles to guide his decision-making.
It seems that way. It shows how personal values and belief systems can deeply inform the way lawmakers interpret and act upon legislation. It's a reminder that these aren't just faceless figures voting on abstract policies. They're individuals wrestling with real moral dilemmas.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Okay, well, from personal values, let's shift our attention to a very real and pressing crisis. The ongoing energy crisis in Puerto Rico.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Years after Hurricane Maria, the island is still struggling with frequent power outages.
I can't believe it's been that long, and they're still dealing with this.
It's heartbreaking, and it's impacting every aspect of life for its residents.
I can only imagine.
This is a heartbreaking example of how policy failures, or at least the slow pace of recovery, can have a devastating and long-lasting impact on a community. Imagine ringing in the new year in the dark. That was the reality for almost 1.2 million Puerto Ricans last New Year's Eve.
That's awful.
It's a stark reminder that the decisions made or not made in the halls of Congress have real-world consequences for millions of Americans, especially those in vulnerable communities.
Yeah, for sure. So what's being done about it?
Thankfully, it seems like there's some bipartisan momentum building to address this crisis.
Good.
We see Representatives Gonzalez Colon, Torres, and Soto from both sides of the aisle banding together to push for a federal emergency declaration.
It's good to see that kind of cooperation.
It shows that even in our highly polarized political environment, there's still the potential for collaboration and problem solving
Yeah.
when the need is urgent and the human cost is undeniable. Now let's take a detour into history for a moment.
Okay.
We're seeing renewed efforts to exonerate Ethel Rosenberg, who was executed for espionage back in 1953.
Wow, that's going back a while.
This case has always been shrouded in controversy, but new evidence is emerging that supports her innocence.
What kind of evidence?
Well, including recanted testimony from her own brother and a recently declassified document from a U.S. Army codebreaker.
That's significant.
It's a chilling reminder of how easily fear and political expediency can undermine justice and due process. If this new evidence is valid, it suggests that the government may have knowingly executed an innocent woman during the height of the Cold War paranoia.
That's a scary thought.
And that raises some unsettling questions about the potential for abuses of power, even in a democracy like ours.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, are there echoes of that same fear-mongering and disregard for evidence in our current political climate?
Right. Are we repeating the mistakes of the past?
It's a question worth pondering, especially as we see certain figures like Elon Musk gaining increasing influence in government affairs.
Interesting.
Musk's involvement with various government agencies, particularly in areas involving sensitive data, has definitely raised some eyebrows.
In what way?
There are growing concerns about potential conflicts of interest. Given his vast business empire and what this means for data privacy for everyday Americans, I mean, this is the guy who's talking about putting chips in our brains, after all. It's not hard to see why people might be a little uneasy about the level of access he has to government data and decision-making processes.
Yeah, that's a bit unsettling.
It's definitely a situation that warrants close scrutiny. As Musk's companies become more intertwined with government functions, we need to be asking tough questions about transparency, accountability, and the potential risks involved.
For sure. But on a more hopeful note, let's talk about Congressman Vell, a freshman representative from Missouri who's bringing a fresh perspective to Congress.
Oh, I've heard of him. He's got a pretty inspiring backstory, right?
He does. As a former prosecutor from Ferguson, Missouri, a city that became synonymous with the Black Lives Matter movement after the shooting of Michael Brown, he's committed to using his position to address issues of racial justice and criminal justice reform.
It sounds like he's bringing a much-needed focus on community engagement and addressing the root causes of crime.
Exactly. He's been working on diversion programs to keep nonviolent offenders out of the criminal justice system, and conviction review units to investigate potential wrongful convictions and instances of police misconduct. He's also been a vocal advocate for the importance of the Black national anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing, as a symbol of hope and resilience in the face of ongoing struggles for equality.
That's beautiful. It's a reminder that even within the often contentious realm of politics, there's room for powerful expressions of culture, identity, and shared history. But let's not forget the bread and butter issues that are affecting millions of Americans, especially those in rural communities and small towns.
Right. There are two bills gaining traction that are specifically aimed at providing relief to farm families and small businesses: the Farm Family and Small Business Exemption Act and the Protect Small Businesses from Excessive Paperwork Act of 2025.
So these bills seem to be recognizing the unique challenges faced by these groups, who are often the backbone of our economy, but also disproportionately affected by economic downturns and bureaucratic hurdles.
Right.
Can you break down what each bill aims to do?
Sure. The Farm Family and Small Business Exemption Act aims to prevent farm assets and small business property from being counted against a student's eligibility for financial aid.
Interesting.
It's an attempt to level the playing field and ensure that children from these backgrounds have equal access to higher education, regardless of their family's assets.
That makes sense. It seems like a step towards recognizing that wealth isn't always liquid and that families who are asset-rich might still struggle to afford college tuition.
Exactly.
What about the second bill?
The Protect Small Businesses from Excessive Paperwork Act of 2025 seeks to address concerns about the complex and often burdensome beneficial ownership reporting requirements that have been imposed on small businesses in recent years.
Okay.
These requirements are intended to prevent money laundering and other financial crimes, but they can be very difficult for small businesses to navigate, often requiring them to hire lawyers or consultants just to comply.
So it's a recognition that sometimes even well-intentioned regulations can have unintended negative consequences, especially for those who don't have the resources to navigate the complexities of the legal and financial systems. It sounds like Congress is trying to find that balance between preventing crime and allowing small businesses to thrive.
Exactly. But, as always, there are differing opinions on how best to achieve that balance. Congressman Jeffries, a Democrat from New York, has been quite critical of what he calls a Republican bait-and-switch when it comes to addressing the high cost of living.
So what's his argument?
He's basically arguing that Republican policies are focused on tax cuts for the wealthy, while failing to address the day-to-day struggles of ordinary Americans who are facing rising costs for housing, healthcare, and childcare. It's a classic example of the partisan divide that often paralyzes Congress, even when there's widespread agreement that a problem exists.
Right. It highlights the fundamental disagreements over economic priorities and the role of government in addressing economic inequality.
Exactly. And it's a debate that's likely to continue as we head into the next election cycle.
Well, it's certainly a reminder that the Congressional Record isn't just a dry record of votes and bills. It's a battleground for ideas, a stage for passionate pleas, and a reflection of the deep divisions and shared hopes of the American people.
It's a messy, complex, and sometimes frustrating process, but it's also democracy in action. And it's through understanding this process, engaging in these debates, and holding our elected officials accountable that we as citizens can truly shape the future of our nation. It certainly is. And while those big picture debates rage on, there are also moments of unity and recognition of shared values tucked away in the Congressional Record.
Oh, really? Like what?
Well, we see tributes to figures like Major General Mason M. Patrick, a key figure in the development of the U.S. Air Force.
Those tributes are always fascinating. They give us a glimpse into the individuals who have shaped our nation both in and out of the political arena. It's a nice reminder that amidst all the partisan wrangling, there's still a sense of respect for those who have served our country.
Absolutely. And speaking of serving our country, there's also strong bipartisan support for initiatives aimed at improving the lives of veterans. One notable example is the Housing Unhoused Disabled Veterans Act,
Ooh.
which seeks to ensure that disabled veterans have equitable access to housing assistance.
It's good to see that there's at least some common ground when it comes to supporting those who have sacrificed so much for our nation. But let's zoom out a bit and look at the international stage. The China Exchange Rate Transparency Act is gaining traction, reflecting growing concerns about China's economic influence.
This bill is designed to address worries about China's currency manipulation practices, aiming to increase transparency and accountability through the International Monetary Fund. It's a sign of the times, really, as tensions between the U.S. and China continue to simmer.
It seems there's a growing consensus, at least within Congress, that we need to take a firmer stance against China's economic practices, especially those that are perceived as giving them an unfair advantage in the global marketplace. But then we also see examples of bipartisan cooperation on other economic matters. The Credit Union Board Modernization Act is a good example.
This one's interesting because it enjoys support from both sides of the aisle. It aims to update the meeting frequency requirements for credit union boards, which might seem like a minor tweak. But the proponents argue that it will actually promote efficiency and attract talented individuals to serve on these boards.
It's about modernizing those institutions to better serve their members, which are often everyday folks looking for accessible and affordable financial services. It's a reminder that sometimes even small legislative changes can have a ripple effect throughout the economy.
Now, shifting gears a bit, we can't overlook the powerful testimony from Congresswoman Mace, a Republican from South Carolina. She bravely shared her personal experiences with abuse, alleging that she was drugged and raped by individuals in her own district. She also revealed that she later discovered illicit recordings that violated her privacy.
Well, that's incredibly disturbing and courageous of her to come forward with such a personal and painful story. It's a stark reminder that even those in positions of power can be victims of abuse, and that speaking out about these issues can be incredibly difficult, especially when it involves potential legal ramifications.
Absolutely. Her testimony has sent shockwaves through Congress, and it's sparked important conversations about the pervasiveness of abuse and the need for stronger protections for victims.
It seems like she's not letting this experience silence her. She's channeling her pain into action, introducing legislation aimed at addressing issues like voyeurism, revenge porn, and ensuring safety in single-sex spaces. It's inspiring to see her using her platform to advocate for change and empower other survivors.
She's also set up a hotline for potential victims to come forward, demonstrating her commitment to supporting others who may have endured similar trauma. It's a testament to her strength and resilience and her determination to use her experience to make a positive impact. Now let's pivot to the Senate, where the confirmation process for Tulsi Gabbard as Director of National Intelligence has become quite heated.
This nomination has definitely stirred up controversy. Her supporters praise her military service and experience in Congress, highlighting her independent voice and willingness to challenge the status quo. But her critics raise concerns about her past statements on foreign policy, particularly those related to Syria and Russia, and her associations with figures considered controversial.
It's a classic example of how past statements and actions can come back to haunt you in the world of politics. And it highlights the intense scrutiny that nominees for high-profile positions, especially those related to national security, face in today's polarized climate.
It seems like this nomination is really testing the boundaries of what's considered acceptable dissent within the foreign policy establishment, and it's going to be interesting to see how the Senate ultimately votes on her confirmation.
Speaking of high-stakes votes, the Senate recently approved a significant arms sale to Israel. This decision underscored the enduring strength of the U.S.-Israel relationship and Israel's need to maintain its self-defense capabilities in a volatile region.
It's a reminder that geopolitical considerations often trump domestic concerns, and that the U.S. continues to play a pivotal role in shaping the balance of power in the Middle East. But let's bring it back home for a moment. We're seeing increasing attention being paid to the crisis of rural hospital closures, with the Rural Hospital Closure Relief Act of 2025 gaining momentum.
This issue has been brewing for years as rural communities across the country face dwindling access to healthcare services. The closure of a hospital can devastate a small town, forcing residents to travel long distances for basic medical care, and it can also have a ripple effect on the local economy.
This bill represents a bipartisan effort to stem the tide of closures and find solutions that can ensure that rural Americans have access to the health care they need. It's a hopeful sign that Congress is recognizing the urgency of this issue and working across the aisle to address it.
And speaking of addressing inequities, there's a bill gaining traction that focuses on the unique status of Washington, D.C. The Equal Federal Funding for the District of Columbia Act aims to ensure that D.C. receives its fair share of federal funding.
This is an issue that often gets overlooked, but it's fundamentally about fairness and representation. The residents of D.C. pay federal taxes, but lack full voting representation in Congress, and they often feel like they're treated as second-class citizens when it comes to federal funding allocations.
This bill is a step towards addressing that imbalance and ensuring that D.C. residents have the same access to federal resources as citizens in any other state. It's a reminder that the fight for equal representation and equitable treatment is an ongoing one, even in the heart of our nation's capital.
It's amazing how the Congressional Record can take us on this whirlwind tour of American life, from the personal struggles of individual lawmakers to the geopolitical maneuvering on the world stage and everything in between.
It's a testament to the breadth and depth of the issues that Congress grapples with every day. And while it can be overwhelming at times, it's also a reminder that our government is at its core a reflection of us, the people.
You know, it's really remarkable how the Congressional Record, despite its kind of official-sounding name, can be such a rich tapestry of American life. We see the big policy debates, of course, but also these glimpses into the personal stories, the local concerns, even like the moments of humor and celebration that make up the fabric of our nation.
Yeah, it's like a microcosm of American society all playing out on the stage of Congress. And what struck me as we went through these entries is that even amidst the partisan battles and, ideological clashes, there's this undercurrent of humanity that keeps surfacing.
I see that.
Whether it's a tribute to a local hero or a heartfelt plea for a struggling community, you get the sense that these lawmakers, despite their differences, are still ultimately trying to do what they believe is best for the people they represent.
Yeah, that's a really important point. It's easy to get cynical about politics,
Really?
right? And focus on the gridlock and the negativity. But I think it's crucial to remember that there are real people behind those votes and speeches, people who are wrestling with complex issues and trying to find solutions that work for everyone.
And that brings us back to the importance of civic engagement. We can't just sit back and complain about the state of politics. We have to get involved, make our voices heard, and hold our elected officials accountable.
So for our listeners who are feeling inspired to take action, what are some concrete steps they can take to stay informed and engaged with the issues that matter most to them?
But for starters, don't be afraid to dive into the Congressional Record yourself. I know it can seem intimidating, but you can search for specific topics or the names of your representatives. You can also sign up for newsletters or follow websites that provide summaries and analysis of key legislative actions.
And there are tons of great podcasts out there, not to toot our own horn or anything, but there are a bunch that break down complex political issues in an accessible and engaging way. And of course, local news outlets are a valuable resource for understanding how national policies are playing out in your community.
Yeah, and don't underestimate the power of just talking to people,
Yeah.
your friends, family, neighbors, about the issues that matter to you.
Yeah, for sure.
Those conversations can spark new ideas, challenge your assumptions, and help you find common ground with those who might hold different views.
And remember, engagement doesn't have to be all about protests and rallies. It can be as simple as writing a letter to your representative, volunteering for a local campaign, or donating to a cause you believe in. Every little bit helps.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up this deep dive into the Congressional Record, I think the key takeaway is that our democracy is a work in progress.
It is.
It's messy, it's imperfect, but it's ours. And it's up to each and every one of us to shape its future.
Beautifully said. Thanks for joining me on this journey through the halls of Congress. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the world around you.